The obsidian blade pressed against the priest's throat wasn't there for his life, it was there for his secrets. Elias Thorne didn't want the gold in the cathedral's vault. He wanted the one thing the holy man couldn't give, a way to kill a ghost without becoming one. Elias Thorne was a man carved from the coldest marble of the underworld, a sovereign of sin whose name was whispered like a curse in the back alleys of the Iron District. For a decade, he had ruled the Syndicate with a hand that knew only the weight of silver and the bite of lead. But as he stood beneath the arched, soot-stained ceilings of the old basilica, the smell of incense felt like a suffocating shroud. He wasn't there to pray, he was there to hunt. Silas Vane, his former protege and the man who had supposedly died carrying the Syndicate's most damning ledgers, had been spotted in the desolate borderlands of the Low Valley. Silas hadn't just stolen the records, he had stolen the Syndicate's future, 300 million in untraceable credits. Elias had tracked him to a crumbling sanctuary for the unfixable, a place where the broken and the forgotten went to wither. But as Elias stepped through the rotted oak doors of the valley's estate, he didn't find a fortress, he found a garden, and in the center of it, holding a rusted watering can instead of a rifle, stood the man he had come to execute. The heavy iron gates of the valley estate didn't just creak, they shivered, a metallic protest against the encroaching shadow of Elias Thorne. He stepped onto the cracked cobblestones, his long midnight blue coat trailing behind him like a funeral banner. The air here was different, thinner, cleaner, lacking the metallic tang of the city's smog. It felt offensive to his lungs. Elias gripped the hilt of the silenced pistol tucked into his waistband. He had spent months imagining this confrontation, picturing Silas Vane cowering in a bunker, surrounded by high-tech security and the spoils of his betrayal. He expected to find a man living like a king on stolen blood money. Instead, he found a ruin. The estate was a skeletal remain of a colonial manor, its walls scarred by time and neglect. But someone had been working here. Patches of the gray stone had been scrubbed clean, and new timber braced the sagging porch. As Elias moved through the overgrown courtyard, he saw rows of tilled earth where vibrant, defying greens poked through the dirt. "The soil is stubborn here, Elias," a voice called out, not from a sniper's nest, but from the shade of a dying willow tree. "It takes a long time for anything to realize it's allowed to grow." Elias froze. That voice, it was the same calm, resonant tone that had once suggested tactical assassinations in his boardroom. He turned, his weapon drawn in a blur of practiced motion. Silas Vane sat on a wooden bench, his hands stained not with blood, but with dark, rich earth. He looked older, thinner, yet possessed a terrifyingly tranquil gaze that Elias couldn't calculate. "Where is it, Elias?" hissed Elias, the barrel of the gun leveled at the space between Silas's eyes. "The 300 million, the ledger of debt. Give me a reason not to paint this garden red." Silas didn't flinch. He didn't even stand. He simply looked at the gun as if it were a curious relic of a past life. "You came for the debt, Elias, but you're standing on the only currency that matters now. Look around. Does this look like the home of a wealthy man?" The standoff was interrupted by a sound Elias hadn't heard in years, a child's laughter. A young girl, perhaps 6 years old, sprinted from the porch towards Silas, her mismatched shoes clattering on the stones. She skidded to a halt when she saw Elias, her eyes widening at the weapon in his hand. "Is he another one who needs the medicine, Uncle Silas?" she asked, her voice pure and devoid of the terror that usually preceded Elias's presence. Silas reached out, his hand, rough and scarred, gently ruffling the girl's hair. "He's an old friend, Mara. He's just lost his way in the woods. Elias felt a surge of nauseating cognitive dissonance. He lowered the gun slightly, not out of mercy, but out of a sudden jarring confusion. The girl, Mara, looked up at him with a gaze that felt like a physical weight. Her eyes were a haunting shade of amber, the exact same eyes as a rival dealer Elias had eliminated in a warehouse fire 3 winters ago. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the solar plexus. This wasn't a hideout for a thief. It was an asylum for the orphans of his own ambition. You used my capital to feed the mouths of my enemy's children? Elias rasped, his voice trembling with a mix of fury and something he refused to name. I used your capital to pay a ransom, Elias, Silas replied, standing slowly. The girl, sensing the shift in energy, retreated toward the porch, but she didn't look away. Every cent is accounted for. It's in the penicillin for the boy with the lung rot. It's in the roof over the head of the woman whose husband you disappeared. It's in the bread you're currently smelling. Silas walked toward Elias, stopping just inches from the muzzle of the gun. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather-bound book, the Ledger of Debt. But it wasn't filled with accounts of money owed. It was a list of names, thousands of them. You came to collect a debt, Silas whispered. But as I looked at these names, I realized the Syndicate was bankrupt, not of money, but of life. I didn't steal your millions, Elias. I invested them in the only thing that could possibly save your soul. Elias stared at the ledger, then at the girl on the porch. The 300 million wasn't in a bank, it was breathing, it was healing, and for the first time in his life, the sovereign of sin felt like the poorest man in the world. Elias snatched the ledger from Silas's hand, his fingers trembling with a cold, frantic energy. He flipped through the pages, expecting to find the codes to the offshore accounts. Instead, he saw meticulous records of restoration. Page 14, 50,000 for a prosthetic limb, Jonas, age 12. Page 22, 12,000 for heart surgery, Clara, widow. His eyes raced down the columns. These weren't just names, they were the ghosts of his career. Every entry corresponded to a cleanup he had ordered, a message he had sent. The 300 million hadn't been spent on luxury, it had been systematically poured into the cracks of the lives he had shattered. This is madness, Elias muttered, the ledger feeling like it was burning his palms. You're a dead man, Silas. The Syndicate doesn't care about orphans. They care about the balance. Then show them the balance, Elias, Silas said, stepping back and gesturing toward the house. Walk through these halls. Look into the rooms. If you can find 1 cent that was spent on my own comfort, pull the trigger. But if you find that I've spent your blood to buy back breath, then you have to ask yourself, who is the real thief? Elias pushed past him, his boots thudding heavily on the porch. He entered the foyer, expecting the smell of decay. Instead, he was met with the scent of pine cleaner and simmering soup. The walls were stripped of their old wallpaper, replaced by a clean whitewash. In every corner there were signs of a slow, agonizing resurrection. He walked into the dining hall. A dozen children sat at a long table, eating quietly. They looked up at him, not with a fearful submission of his henchmen, but with a quiet, observant curiosity. One boy, his arm in a sling, held out a piece of bread toward Elias. "Are you hungry, sir? Uncle Silas says we always have enough for one more." Elias looked at the bread, then at his own hands. They were clean, manicured, and deadly. The boy's hands were stained with flour and coal dust. The contrast was a silent scream. He turned and fled the room, his heart hammering a rhythm he didn't recognize. He found himself in a small chapel at the back of the house, a place Silas had clearly turned into a clinic. There, on a cot, lay an old man Elias recognized as a former street runner for the Syndicate. The man was dying, but his face was peaceful. Silas sat beside the man, wiping his brow with a wet cloth. "You're not just a traitor, Elias," Silas whispered from the doorway. "You're a fool. You think you can undo 10 years of slaughter with a few $1,000,000 and some soup?" "I'm not trying to undo it, Elias," Silas said without looking up. "I'm trying to pay the interest on a debt we can never fully settle. Grace isn't about erasing the past. It's about building a future where the past isn't allowed to dictate the turns anymore." Elias stayed. He told himself it was to monitor the asset, to wait for the right moment to retrieve the remaining funds he was convinced were hidden somewhere in the walls. But as the days bled into a week, the sovereign found himself shed of his midnight coat. "If you're staying, you're working," Silas had said, handing him a rusted spade. "Idleness is the devil's playground, and we've had enough of his games." By the 4th day, Elias's hands were blistered. He was tasked with repairing the stone wall that bordered the garden, the wall he had intended to breach with fire and lead. It was back-breaking, repetitive labor. Every stone had to be fitted perfectly, every gap filled with mortar. It was the opposite of his life in the city, where he tore things down with a single word. As he worked, he watched Silas. The man who had once been his most ruthless lieutenant was now a servant. Silas spent his mornings in the infirmary and his afternoons in the kitchen. He didn't lead by command, he led by sacrifice. He ate the smallest portions, took the hardest shifts, and slept on a cot in the hallway so a sick child could have his bed. "Why?" Elias asked one evening as they sat on the porch, the sun dipping below the valley ridge. "You had the money. You could have disappeared to an island. You could have been a god." "I was a god in the city, Elias," Silas replied, his voice tired but steady. "And I was miserable. Power is a hungry ghost. The more you feed it, the more it wants. But mercy is a seed. You plant it, and it feeds you back." Elias looked at his calloused palms. The steel and shadow of his former life felt like a dream, a loud, violent dream. Here, the only sounds were the wind in the willow and the rhythmic clink of his spade against the stone. "The Syndicate is coming, Silas," Elias said, his voice dropping. "He's already tracking the wire transfers you used to buy the medical supplies. He won't see a garden, he'll see a target." "I know," Silas said, looking out over the rows of green. "That's why I'm glad you're here, not for your gun, Elias, but because you need to see what's worth dying for before you can ever truly learn how to live." The transformation of Elias Thorne was not a sudden explosion, but a slow erosion. One morning he found himself in the kitchen, awkwardly attempting to peel potatoes for the midday stew. His movements were clumsy, his frustration evident, but the children gathered around him, giggling at the fancy man struggling with a vegetable. "You have to go deep, Mr. Elias," Mara said, stepping onto a stool to show him. "Otherwise, the eyes stay in and they taste bitter." Elias looked at the potato. Go deep. It was a metaphor he wasn't ready to handle. As he worked, he felt the gaze of the house on him, not the suspicious eyes of guards, but the expectant eyes of a family. He was becoming a part of the foundation. That afternoon, he went to the infirmary to see the old runner, Leo. The man was weaker now, his breath a raspy rattle. Silas was busy with a child who had a fever, so Elias sat by Leo's bed. He didn't know what to do. He reached out and awkwardly took the old man's hand. "Elias?" Leo whispered, his eyes fluttering open. "Is that you? Did the boss come to finish it?" "No, Leo," Elias said, his voice cracking. "The boss is under renovation. Just rest." Leo smiled, a jagged, beautiful sight. Silas told us the king was coming to take us home. I thought he meant the city, but this is better. The man died an hour later, holding the hand of the man who had once treated him like an expendable pawn. Elias didn't call for Silas. He washed the body himself. He carried Leo out to the garden and dug the grave. As he lowered the body into the earth, he realized he wasn't just burying a runner, he was burying the man he used to be. When Silas joined him at the graveside, he didn't say a word. He simply handed Elias a small wooden cross he had fashioned. "He's free now," Silas said. "Is any of us?" Elias asked, looking at the house. "We're just waiting for the executioner, Silas. You've built a paradise on a battlefield." "Every paradise is a battlefield, Elias," Silas replied. "The question is what you're fighting with. You can use a sword to protect a throne, or you can use your body to protect the weak. One makes you a king, the other makes you a son." The peace was shattered on the 10th day. The low, rhythmic thrum of black SUVs echoed through the valley, a sound that didn't belong in the silence of the sanctuary. Elias was in the garden, helping Silas reinforce the trellis for the climbing roses when the first vehicle breached the iron gates. Marco stepped out, his tailored suit a sharp, jarring contrast to the dirt and sweat of the estate. Behind him were 6 men, all armed with submachine guns. They didn't look at the flowers. They looked at the traitor and the fallen sovereign. "Well, well," Marco sneered, his eyes scanning Elias's dirt-smudged face. "The king of the district has turned into a peasant. I heard rumors you'd gone soft, Elias, but this is pathetic." Elias stepped forward, his heart cold and focused. He didn't have his coat or his primary weapon, only the small pistol tucked into his work trousers. "The money is gone, Marco. Every cent. It's been spent on the debts we owed these people. Walk away. There's nothing for the Syndicate here." Marco laughed, a jagged sound that made the children on the porch shrink back. "The Syndicate doesn't walk away from 300 million, Elias, and they certainly don't walk away from a message that needs to be sent. If the money is in the walls, we'll tear the walls down. If it's in the people, we'll bleed it out of them." He raised his hand, a signal for his men to move, but Silas stepped in front of Elias, his arms spread wide, unarmed and unmoving. "There is a greater power here than your lead, Marco," Silas said, his voice ringing with a terrifying authority. "You can kill us, but you cannot unfeed the children. You cannot unheal the sick. The investment has already matured. It's out of your reach." "We'll see about that," Marco growled, leveling his weapon at Silas's chest. In that moment, Elias realized the truth of the Trojan horse. Silas hadn't just stolen the money to help people. He had stolen it to draw the darkness into the light, where it could finally be confronted. Elias didn't reach for his gun to kill Marco. He reached for a heavy stone from the garden wall, the very stone he had spent days smoothing. "If you want the debt settled, Marco," Elias said, stepping beside Silas, "you start with me. I'm the one who authorized the expenditures. I'm the one who stayed to see the work finished." The tension was a physical cord stretched to the breaking point. For a moment, the king of the district and the servant stood as a single wall against the storm. The first shot didn't hit Silas. It hit the stone pillar of the porch, showering Mara and the other children in splinters. The scream that followed was the catalyst for the end of Elias's old world. Elias moved with a speed that defied his recent labor. He didn't retreat, he charged, not as an assassin, but as a shield. He tackled the nearest gunman, the struggle shifting from the gravel to the dirt of the garden. He felt a searing pain in his shoulder as a bullet grazed him, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. The faces of the children were burned into his retinas. Silas, meanwhile, was a ghost in the chaos. He didn't pick up a gun. He moved through the gunfire, pulling children into the cellar, shielding the infirm with his own body. He was the living sacrifice in real time. Elias found himself face to face with Marco in the center of the foyer. The whitewashed walls were being riddled with holes, the foundation under assault. Marco's face was twisted in a mask of professional fury. "You threw it all away for this?" Marco screamed, firing wildly. "For a bunch of half-dead nobodies?" "They aren't nobodies," Elias roared, lunging forward. He took a hit to the thigh, his leg buckling, but he used his momentum to drive Marco through the glass doors of the infirmary. They crashed into the room where Leo had died. Elias felt the cold floor against his back, his blood pooling on the clean wood. Marco stood over him, breathing hard, his gun jammed. "You're a failure, Elias," he spat, reaching for a knife. "You died for nothing." "No," a voice said from the doorway. Silas stood there, his shirt soaked in blood, none of it his own. He held the ledger of debt. "He didn't die for nothing, Marco. He died for the names in this book, and you're not on the list." Before Marco could react, the heavy oak wardrobe, one Elias had helped Silas move just 2 days prior, toppled forward. It hadn't been an accident. The supports had been weakened during the firefight. Marco vanished beneath the weight of the Syndicate's furniture. Silence fell over the house, heavy and thick with the scent of gunpowder and rain. Elias lay on the floor, his vision blurring. He saw Silas kneeling beside him, pressing a cloth to his wounds. "Is the house still standing?" Elias whispered. "The house is fine, Elias," Silas said, his voice a steady anchor. "The walls can be patched, but you're finally level." The aftermath was a blur of resurrection. The Syndicate's men, seeing their leader crushed and the sovereign transformed, fled into the night. They were predators who only understood strength. They had no idea how to fight a man who had already accepted his own death. Elias woke up 3 days later in the infirmary bed where Leo had passed. His body was a map of bandages and aches, but his mind was strangely clear. The fever of the city had finally broken. He looked out the window. The garden was a mess of trampled plants and spent shells, but the children were already out there with rakes and shovels. They were cleaning. They were rebuilding. Tressa, the woman who ran the kitchen, brought him a bowl of soup. She didn't look at him with the cold distance she had shown a week ago. She sat on the edge of the bed and helped him sit up. "Silas says you're going to live," she said, "which is a shame because we were going to use your coat to patch the roof." Elias managed a weak smile. "The coat was always too heavy anyway." "You did a good thing, Elias," she whispered, her hand briefly touching his. "You stood in the gap. Not many men from your world know how to do that." "I didn't do it for the good," Elias admitted, his voice raspy. "I did it because I couldn't look at Mara's eyes and see my own reflection anymore. I wanted to see something else." Later that day, Silas came in. He looked weary, his arm in a sling, but his eyes were bright. He sat down and placed the ledger of debt on the bedside table. "It's empty, Elias," Silas said. "What do you mean?" Elias asked. "The Syndicate's accounts. I finished the final transfers this morning. The last of the 300 million has been dispersed into trust funds for every name in this book. There is no more money to steal, no more debt to collect. The Syndicate is effectively bankrupt." "And us?" Elias asked. "We're just people in a house, Elias," Silas said, leaning back. "No titles, no sovereigns, just a family under construction." The new era began with the arrival of spring. The Valley Estate, once a place of shadows, was now known as the Hearth. It had become a sanctuary, not just for the orphans of the district, but for anyone seeking a new identity. Elias Thorne, the man who once ruled through fear, was now the estate's foreman. He spent his days teaching the older boys how to lay stone and his evenings reading to the younger ones. He still carried the scars of the battle with Marco, a physical testimony of the price of grace. The ledger of debt remained on the mantel in the foyer, but it was no longer used for accounting. It was used as a guest book. Every person who entered the house signed their name, not as a debtor, but as a joint heir to the peace they had found. One afternoon, Elias was working on the iron gates. He was removing the rust, painting them a bright, welcoming white. Silas walked up, watching him work. "You missed a spot," Silas teased, pointing to a hinge. "I'm getting to it," Elias grunted, though there was no heat in his voice. "This gate shouldn't just keep people out, Silas. It should tell them they're welcome to come in." "A gateway of grace," Silas mused. "I like it." They stood together for a moment, looking down the long, winding road that led back to the city. The district was still there, dark and grinding, but its reach no longer felt infinite. "Do you ever miss it, Elias?" Silas asked. "The power, the feeling of being the only man in the room who mattered?" Elias looked at his hands, stained with white paint, scarred by labor, and currently holding a child's toy he had picked up from the grass. "I never mattered in that room, Silas," Elias said. "I was just a ghost haunting a throne. Here I'm finally solid. I'm a builder. I'm a father. I'm a man who is forgiven." "Then the work is finished," Silas said, clapping him on the shoulder. "No," Elias corrected, looking at the house full of life. "The work is just beginning. Every day is a new stone." The story of the stolen millions became a legend in the Iron District, but not in the way the Syndicate intended. It wasn't a cautionary tale of betrayal. It was a gospel of transformation. Rumors spread of a place in the valley where the debt was paid, where the sovereign had become a servant, and where blood money had been turned into bread. Elias Thorne lived out the rest of his days at the Hearth. He never returned to the city. He didn't need to. He had built a kingdom that didn't require a crown. In his final years, he was often found in the garden, sitting under the same willow tree where he had first found Silas. He would tell the children stories, not of his crimes, but of the great exchange. He told them of a man who had everything and gave it up to buy a field, and of a treasure that was hidden in the hearts of the broken. When he finally passed, he didn't leave a will. He didn't have any assets to distribute. He left only a house that was full, a garden that was green, and a ledger that was blank. At his funeral, Silas Vane stood before the hundreds of people who had found life within those walls. He didn't talk about Elias's past. He talked about his foundation. "Elias Thorne didn't just build a house," Silas said, his voice echoing through the valley. "He became one. He allowed himself to be broken so that we could be made whole. He traded his steel for spirit and his shadow for light. He was the first of us to realize that the only way to truly win is to lose everything for the sake of love." As they lowered Elias into the earth beside Leo and the others, Silas placed a single white rose on the casket. It was a rose from the trellis Elias had died protecting, a flower that grew from the soil he had once tried to salt.